In the 1950s, a youth culture of rebellion began to take shape. In the 1960s, the youth movement escalated from rebellion against traditional values and against personal rebellion against parents to outright revolution against the state. The aim of much of America's youth was literally the overthrow of the old culture in its entirety. Much of the rebellion against the status quo started at university campuses such as the one at the University of California at Berkeley.
We are the people of this generation, bred in at least modest comfort, housed now in universities, looking uncomfortably to the world we inherit.
So began the Port Huron Statement, a proclamation of 59 people, including student activist Tom Hayden, who attended a meeting of the Students for a Democratic Society in 1961 in Port Huron, some 40 miles north of Detroit. Although pessimism would soon overtake the 60s generation, the decade was ushered in with a growing sense of idealism and a sense of possibility for political and social change.
The climate of high idealism was nowhere more evident than at the University of California campus at Berkeley. The university's attempt to suppress anti-discrimination and anti-segregation demonstrations in the fall of 1964 spawned campus-wide rebellion. It gave birth to the free speech movement, which established a model for protests nationwide.
The student rebels, sometimes called the New Left, condemned the continuation of the Cold War. They issued a call to replace the arms race with the disarmament race. The New Left called attention to the larger moral dimensions of local issues, used the activist techniques of the civil rights movement, and enlisted liberal faculty members in their causes. The students staged sit-ins, invaded administration buildings, held strikes, and were arrested. The slogans of the University of California students summed up the new student attitude.
My mind is not the property of the University of California.
I am a UC student. Do not bend, fold, spindle, or mutilate.
You can't trust anyone over 30.
Stopping the war in Vietnam became the New Left's cause. On April 17, 1965, 20,000 protesters gathered here in Washington, D.C. to protest American combat troops in Vietnam.
And I'd like to turn in my Bronze Star and 2 Purple Hearts. I lost my leg in Vietnam, and I'm totally opposed to this war we're carrying on over there. And Senator Buckley and Congressman James Hanley will receive my medals next week in the mail. Thank you.
The polarization between the older generation and the students soon became known as the so-called generation gap. It was not just a question of parents no longer understanding their children. The children had lost faith in the ideals of the America their parents had embraced. To the New Left, America the good was becoming America the bad.
The Vietnam protest movement was as much a cultural movement as it was an anti-war movement. This cultural movement was led not only by political activists, but by politicized musicians as well. Foremost among these musician activists was Bob Dylan, who was born in 1941.
Writing and performing his own songs, Dylan did not see his work as mere entertainment. His lyrics had political, social, and even spiritual messages.
And how long have you been writing your own music?
For about 2 years.
Just 2 years?
7 years before that, but I quit writing, and I started copying for about 2 or 3 years between.
However, almost all his songs had a common theme: to question middle-class values and to parody the hypocrisy of the establishment. Bob Dylan was influenced by many writers and artists, including the 19th century French poet Arthur Rimbaud and the 1950s beat poet Allen Ginsberg, who both had rebelled against the status quo of their own day in both word and deed.
The powerlessness and hatred of the status quo was not only played out in the music of the 60s, but also in the many innovative films of the 1960s. A new generation of filmmakers pushed the social agenda of the New Left, the anti-Vietnam War movement, the emerging drug culture, and the student movement.
During the 1960s, the climate was ripe for radical experimentation in the arts. Court rulings in favor of free speech and relaxed social standards were erasing sexual and social taboos in films. Directors soon took advantage of the relaxed standards. Like Bob Dylan, who wrote and performed his own songs, the new American directors became the ultimate authority of their film's content. Movies became personal, political, and social statements, not just entertainment. This sense of artistic ownership can be seen in many American films of the 1960s and 70s, such as director Arthur Penn's classic Bonnie and Clyde. Film historians Leonard Quart and Albert Oster write, "There are suggestions in the exaggerated, murderous use of police firepower, for example, the bloody shootout where the police used an armored car, of the American military's penchant for overkill in Vietnam." Other films by Arthur Penn address the public disillusionment with corrupt government, racial disharmony, and the oppressiveness of the military-industrial complex.
They'll kill you. Let him go, Billy.
They'll kill you.
They've been killing me.
What are you going to do?
I don't run, I don't hide. I go where I want. I do what I want.
By the mid-1960s, the American film industry moved from being part of the establishment to wholeheartedly joining the counterculture.
A new and explosive motion picture experience, which we predict will be one of the most talked about and raved about pictures this year.
This year, the judges...
One such countercultural statement was the popular film Easy Rider. Made in 1969, Easy Rider depicted the us against them theme and struck a powerful anti-establishment emotional chord.
They're not scared of you. They're scared of what you represent to them. Amen. All we represent to them, man, is somebody who needs a haircut. Oh, no. What you represent to them is freedom.
Jack Nicholson, playing an articulate, witty, alcoholic lawyer, George Hanson, sets the despairing tone with his line,
"This used to be a hell of a good country. I don't understand what's going on with it."
A trend began with movies like Easy Rider and Bonnie and Clyde that was soon copied by hundreds of filmmakers who seemed intent on outdoing one another in dismantling traditional American values, attacking all remaining taboos, expanding what was sexually acceptable behavior on the screen, and above all, expanding the social consciousness of their growing audiences. In the 1960s, the winds of revolution also blew across other artistic forms. One revolutionary artist was the musician and composer John Cage.
So what the analysis does is stores what's unique about your voice.
John Cage's unconventional works attack the uniqueness and majesty of art itself. Cage objected to music's traditional limitations.
If a sound is unfortunate enough not to have a letter, it's tossed out of the system on the grounds it's a noise or unmusical.
Calling traditionally composed music products of a composer's vanity, he claimed,
"By flipping coins to determine facets of my music, I chain my ego so that it cannot possibly affect it."
Cage believed that an artist was required to avoid using reason to create patterns in art. For example, Cage believed that tosses of a coin could be used to create abstract patterns. Chance was everything. Human creativity in its traditional sense was downplayed. Cage's music became a collection of unintentional sounds. He claimed that all sounds have value, and that there is no absolute frame of reference or melody, harmony, or rhythm.
In the late 50s and early 60s, English artists such as David Hockney, Alan Jones, and Peter Blake created an original style that matched the chance musical creations of John Cage. This new visual format came to be known as pop art. Pop art used everyday images and objects and gave them new and often absurd meaning by focusing attention on them.
Like John Cage, the pop artists believe that all objects, however absurd, are equally important. Soup cans, comic book characters, can openers, donuts. Every modern piece of trivia and popular culture was seen as legitimate subject matter. Art began to parody art itself. Robert Rauschenberg's 1955 work, entitled Bed, was a composite of his own pillow, sheet, and patchwork quilt, stabbed and dripped with various colors of paint, from the top of the pillow down to the quilt. Andy Warhol also attempted to deal with America's prepackaged, ready-made, repetitive modern culture. Warhol said,
"I want to be a machine, to print, to repeat repetitiously, to bring forth novelties."
Warhol's Campbell's Soup Can illustrates his view of Western culture's gluttony. It mimicked advertising, which he believed flattered the consumer and encouraged the consumer to view himself as a discriminating connoisseur of sensation and taste. In the 50s and 60s, the pop art of Robert Rauschenberg, Jasper Johns, Andy Warhol, and others was understandable to kindred spirits, but not to the mass public. However, other pop artists, by employing images of rock stars and actors, would blend pop art and actual pop culture in a way that made pop art style part of the mainstream. The all-time most popular media figures to emerge from the 1960s, the Beatles, became art objects as pop artists designed album covers and other images for them. The Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band cover, designed in 1967 by Peter Blake, is the most recognized pop rock record cover ever made.
In the late 1960s, painting in America was no longer the primary form of artistic expression. it had lost the competition with mass media. As painting lost its prominence, artists began to search for new ways to communicate their ideas. One of the best-known attempts at creating an alternative to painting were events called happenings.
In happenings, the line between reality and fantasy was finally and completely blurred. Artists staged outrageous public events where the audience participated as part of the art. Art became life, and life became art. Alan Capro reduced people to mere props in his 1965 happening titled Calling. 3 individuals wrapped in sheets lay silent and motionless against an information booth in New York's Grand Central Station, amidst commuters and passers-by. The line between art and life, craft and mere trivia, was completely erased.
In the early 1960s, at the same time that pop art and the happenings were taking place, the same message of confusion was also being expressed in some of the pop music. The Beatles emerged to shape an entire generation by giving them a universal link through music. Although their early songs were fairly traditional in content, as the Beatles grew in popularity, they began to experiment with new forms of music and also to radicalize the social content of their music. It was here at the Ed Sullivan Theater on February 9, 1964 in New York City that the Beatles first appeared on television to an American audience.
The Beatles' appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show launched their career in America. It also set a ratings record, making the Beatles into instant superstars. 73 million Americans watched their performance.
Ed, you've now officially been exposed to what they call Beatlemania. What do you think?
Well, it's been the most exciting experience for all of us on the show and all of the newspapermen in New York and the police and everything, because in addition to the tremendous hold these youngsters, these English youngsters have on the kids there, they're very nice themselves. So the great pleasure has been in dealing with them because they're modest and they're normal and they take it tongue-in-cheek. So it was a tremendous experience, and of course that audience last night, I've never seen anything like that in the theater.
3,000 screaming teenagers are at New York's Kennedy Airport to greet, you guessed it, the Beatles. This rock and roll group has taken over as the kingpins of musical appreciation among the younger element. Their first meeting with the American press brings forth an interview laced with quips and humor. You'd laugh too, with a gross of $17 million.
By April 1964, the Beatles had the top 5 spots on the Hot 100 Billboard chart with the songs Can't Buy Me Love, Twist and Shout, She Loves You, I Want to Hold Your Hand, and Please Please Me. The Beatles, however, had more in mind than churning out hit singles. They soon revealed a serious social, political, and religious viewpoint. For instance, the songs on their Rubber Soul album, released on December 3, 1965, such as George Harrison's Think for Yourself, showed a biting cynicism.
Some of the fences hold, others do not. A minor miracle is mounted by the fact that there are no injuries spread among the near hysterical crowd. This truly is a social document.
Although by 1966 the public demand for the Beatles seemed insatiable, a furor arose over John Lennon's now famous statement that the Beatles were more popular than Jesus Christ. Lennon publicly retracted his statement, and the Chicago Daily News proclaimed him forgiven.
I pointed out that fact in reference to England, that we meant more to kids than Jesus did, or religion at that time. I wasn't knocking it or putting it down, I was just saying it as a fact. And it is true, especially more for England than here. You know, but I'm not saying that we're better or greater or comparing us with Jesus Christ as a person or God as a thing or whatever it is. You know, I just said what I said and it was wrong or was taken wrong, and now it's all this.
Some, however, defended Lenin, including a Wisconsin minister who said,
"They should take a look at their own values and standards. There is much validity in what Lenin said. To many people, the golf course is also more popular than Jesus Christ."
Following their 1966 San Francisco concert, the Beatles would retreat into the studio and produce a more introspective and avant-garde music.
The Beatles' 1967 album, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, is considered the most powerful popular music statement of the 20th century. From Sgt. Pepper's on, rock music was considered a true art form. The album eclipsed all pop music statements that have preceded it. There's never been anything comparable to it. The album successfully fused pop art, counterculture, and the rock music culture.
Sgt. Pepper's became an international anthem for an entire generation as it embraced the psychedelic vision. This vision included drugs to achieve a new consciousness, heralded change, and offered the hope of triumph of the youth culture.
The Sgt. Pepper's album ends with a reprise of the title song, fading into the climactic classic, A Day in the Life. As John Lennon wrote in his song, A Day in the Life, "I read the news today, oh boy, about a lucky man who made the grade. And though the news was rather sad, well, I just had to laugh. I saw the photograph. He blew his mind out in a car. He didn't notice that the lights had changed. A crowd of people stood and stared. They had seen his face before. Nobody was really sure if he was from the House of Lords. I'd love to turn you on." This song sets the Sgt. Pepper's album and the Beatles' entire career in perspective. A Day in the Life finishes with a fading piano crescendo. In order to create the end-of-the-world sound that John Lennon wanted for the song's finale, the Beatles simultaneously struck an E major chord on 3 grand pianos, drawing out the sound as long as possible with electronic enhancement. The pop culture of the Beatles inspired a whole movement of young people. It also contributed to what was known as the hippie movement. The hippies inherited the beat counterculture, repackaged and championed by the Beatles.
The hippies gravitated to the old beat mecca, San Francisco, where they expanded on the beat formula with even more use of drugs and drug-inspired music. Faith in the power of drugs and rock music to expand the mind and lead to new insights into the meaning of life were fundamental to the hippie culture, as were free love and sexual promiscuity. In January 1967, hippies gathered in San Francisco's Golden Gate Park for a massive happening called the Human Be-In. Poet Allen Ginsberg, political activist Jerry Rubin, drug guru Timothy Leary, and the rock group The Grateful Dead were all present as representatives of both the hippie culture and its beat predecessor. Free food was provided by the Diggers, a so-called anarchist group based in the Haight-Ashbury district, and the free drug, LSD, was supplied by a local drug czar.
In August of 1969, the hippie subculture came to an end with one last convulsive outburst. 400,000 hippies gathered at Woodstock for a last celebration of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. The Woodstock Rock Festival bridged the idealistic counterculture of the 60s with the drug culture of the 1970s.
Well, come on, all of you big, strong men. Uncle Sam needs your help again. He's got himself in a terrible jam way down yonder in Vietnam. So
Woodstock was about peace, sex, and drugs, not necessarily in that order. Knowing that they were making history, the Woodstock organizers arranged for massive press coverage and negotiated a deal for a movie about Woodstock.
Well, there ain't no time to wonder why. For me, we're all gonna die. Come on, Wall Street, don't be slow. Why, man, this war a go-go. There's plenty good money to be made by supplying the army with the tools of his trade, but just open...
The commercial undertones of Woodstock foreshadowed the fact that the hippies of the 1960s would soon become the yuppie entrepreneurs of the materialistic 1970s and 1980s.
And it's 5, 6, 7, open up the pearly gates. Well, there ain't no time to wonder why.
The rebellious ideas of the counterculture finally became just another part of American consumerism. The student and New Left rebels became the backbone of the so-called tenured left. The tenured left is made up of the establishment professors. In the 1980s, these professors came to control the universities. Unfortunately, the political correctness movement, which permeates many modern university campuses, now imitates many things that the New Left once stood against. This was an ironic finish to a movement that had once espoused free speech. In spite of the hippie and the New Left's return to conventional life and American-style consumerism, the 60s generation unleashed a spirit of moral anarchy and political chaos that has shaped our society ever since. The rebellious mood of the old counterculture has now manifested itself in such things as the white supremacy movement and the black separatist movement and their many extremist offshoots. America has become tribalized in the process, a nation of competing interest groups.
About a third of the building has been blown away.
Terrorism, such as the bombing of the federal building in Oklahoma City in April of 1995, may be the face of the new revolution, the final sequel to the fragmentation of the 1960s. Today, there is little talk of peace and love. Many of today's revolutionaries speak only of paranoia and power. Idealism has given way to raw competition for the right to control others.